They expected chains, barbed wire, maybe a kick or two. What they got instead rattled them in a way they hadn't imagined. The German prisoners rolled into the American Midwest during World War II, bracing for punishment, but found themselves walking open fields, breathing in fresh country air, and running their hands through soil that stretched further than they could see. This wasn't the captivity they pictured when they surrendered, half-starved and exhausted on faraway battlefields. The army hustled them from train stations to sprawling camps built almost overnight. But out past the fences, the real surprise was waiting. Local farmers, desperate for help since so many young Americans had shipped off to war, came looking for workers. Deals between the War Department and local farm bureaus put these POWs to work. Instead of sitting around behind barbed wire, the Germans found themselves out in the fields, planting, tending, harvesting. For men used to the harsh discipline of war, it felt odd to be told to hoe rows of corn or haul sacks of wheat. Plenty of them sneered at first. Farming? That was grunt work, handed down from fathers and grandfathers. Nothing special. Back home, German farms ran on tradition, not fancy machines or new ideas. Most of these guys had never seen farming as something you could improve, let alone a place for scientific breakthroughs. Even so, the first look at American farms shook their assumptions. Barns bigger than houses held machines they couldn't name. Fields ran in huge, perfect grids, not the patchwork they knew from Europe. And the food, so much of it. Grain, cattle, milk, more than they'd seen in years of rationing and scarcity. The Americans handled them with a weird mix of watchfulness and straight-up practicality. Sure, the guards kept an eye out, but once the POWs hit the fields, rifles dropped to shoulders and the atmosphere changed. Instructions came in simple English. Sometimes just gestures, sometimes with help from an interpreter. Some prisoners grumbled, feeling humiliated, but soon most realized working outside beat staring at fences all day. Curiosity crept in. The war had trained these men to expect fists or bullets, not shovels and quiet. Sometimes a farmer would speak German with a familiar accent, a reminder that, not so long ago, their own families might have met in a village square. At night, the POWs came back to camp bone-tired but shocked by the meals. Fresh milk, vegetables, meat, portions they'd never dreamed of back home. For men from bombed-out towns, just tasting these foods was like stepping into a new world. Those first weeks, disbelief hung over everything. Captivity was supposed to mean shame and punishment. Yet here they were, learning the rhythms of a foreign land's farming. The Americans didn't seem to draw their strength from parades or slogans, but from the dirt and the sheer size of their fields. The quiet, steady work of feeding a whole country and its armies. For Germans who'd always prided themselves on discipline and order, this hit hard. They were seeing, like it or not, another kind of power, one built on harvest, not conquest. At first, they figured the fieldwork would just be muscle work. What really caught them off guard, though, was the education that followed. American farm bosses didn't just toss them a shovel and walk off. They showed them how things worked, explained why, and made it clear that farming was a craft built on knowledge, not just habit. Most of these Germans came from little villages in Bavaria, Saxony, Prussia, places where you planted rye in the same spot every year, turned dirt with horses, followed the old routines. Now suddenly they were bumping up against ideas that felt like science fiction. Take crop rotation. Instead of planting the same thing over and over, Americans mapped out long sequences. Corn, then beans, wheat, then clover, each crop feeding the next. It sounded like a math problem, but it worked. The land stayed rich, the crops got stronger. Survival wasn't the only goal. Improvement mattered too. The prisoners listened, half skeptical, as farmers pointed at fields of alfalfa, grown just to make the soil better. Then came irrigation. In parts of the Midwest and South, the POWs saw water pumped and piped across whole fields, something most of them had never imagined, coming from places where every rainstorm was a blessing. The sheer scale of it all left them speechless. Bit by bit, the German prisoners began to grasp something that, at first, seemed almost impossible: how America could send vast armies far across the ocean, fighting wars on distant shores, yet still keep store shelves at home brimming with food. The secret was not just in the sheer size of the land, but in how Americans approached it. The earth here didn't just yield to brute force or endless labor. It responded to those who truly listened, who learned its moods and patterns, who treated it with respect and curiosity. The Germans, who had grown up with a sense of the land as something you conquered or endured, found themselves surprised by this gentler, more scientific stewardship. Soil conservation was a revelation to them. Where they were used to hearing farmers grumble about losing topsoil or watching precious dirt wash away in spring floods, here they saw a different attitude entirely. American farmers talked not just of yields, but of care, about contour plowing that followed the natural bend of the hills instead of cutting heedlessly through them, about planting winter cover crops to anchor the earth, even about building terraces to slow the rush of rain. These weren't just clever tricks. They were part of a philosophy that saw the land not as an endless resource, but as a partner in a long-term effort. Some prisoners remembered reading about the Dust Bowl in old pre-war newspapers, those grim stories of choking dust storms and ruined farms, but now they saw how those old disasters had sparked a revolution. America had faced a calamity, and instead of despair, it had chosen to learn, to adapt, using science to guard what mattered most. Every day, the Germans absorbed more than just sun and dust as they worked the fields. They found themselves in a living classroom shaped by the seasons and the rows of crops, rather than by chalkboards or lectures. At first, many were content just to follow orders, doing the menial labor expected of prisoners. But as days became weeks, curiosity crept in. Especially for those who'd once studied agriculture, chemistry, or engineering, men who'd left behind university lectures for war. They began to see the farm as a place of experiment and discovery. They peppered American farmers with awkward questions, scribbled what answers they could in battered notebooks, and tried to puzzle out the logic behind every new technique. By the time planting season ended, many of their old assumptions had fallen away. Where once they'd dismissed talk of soil chemistry or crop rotation as unnecessary complications, now the evidence was right before their eyes. Fields of corn so dense and tall they seemed to form walls of green, beans and alfalfa thriving in soil that looked dark and alive. The results were undeniable, and even the most skeptical prisoners felt their confidence in the old European ways begin to falter. These lessons, reluctantly learned, would linger long after their captivity ended, shaping how they saw farming, and perhaps even their own futures. But beyond the science, what truly stunned them, what left the deepest mark, was the unceasing roar and clatter of machines. Back home in Germany, tractors were rare, nearly mythical things, usually seen only on the grand estates of the wealthy or in the pages of farm catalogs. Most villages still depended on horses or oxen, plodding patiently through the fields, and many of the tools were little changed from those used a century before. Mechanization was still a distant dream for most. But here, in America, machines were everywhere, transforming the landscape. The prisoners would stand, mouths agape, watching a combine harvester sweep across a field, cutting, threshing, and collecting wheat in a single, seamless motion. Acres of grain disappeared in a matter of hours, neatly gathered into bins, where once it would have taken whole villages days of back-breaking labor. To men who had endured rationing and hunger, who'd watched their families struggle through shortages and deprivation, this was more than just impressive. It was a revelation of power. Here was the industrial might that let America not only feed itself, but supply its armies and send aid to allies around the globe. The tractors, bulky bright green John Deeres and solid red International harvesters, moved across the fields with a confidence and energy that seemed almost alive. For some of the prisoners, especially those lucky enough to be trusted behind the wheel, the experience was both daunting and exhilarating. They fumbled with unfamiliar controls, ground gears, and sometimes stalled in the mud, but the raw force of the machine was unmistakable. One former artilleryman remarked that the power beneath him was like his old gun, but now it was being used to build, to nurture, to feed. It seemed every task had its specialized tool. Mechanical plows sliced the earth with a precision and speed that left perfect, ruler-straight furrows behind. Seed drills planted kernels at exact depths, eliminating guesswork and waste. In the barns, the prisoners found a bewildering assortment of gadgets. Machines that pumped water from wells, chopped silage for cattle, baled hay into neat blocks. The barns themselves felt less like old-world stables and more like workshops, humming with innovation and purpose. It dawned on them that America's farms had become a different kind of army, fighting not with tanks or artillery, but with an arsenal of machines against the age-old enemies of hunger and want. Perhaps most surprising was how commonplace all this was. These weren't showpiece farms built for display or demonstration. This was the everyday reality for thousands of American families. Even small farmers, who in Germany would have struggled with little more than hand tools and animal power, here had access to technology that, back home, only the rich could dream of. Mass production had democratized progress, spreading the benefits of mechanization across the countryside. The prisoners realized that this, more than any single machine or method, was the true source of American abundance, a culture that treated innovation as something for everyone, not just for an elite few. As the season wore on, the Germans became more than just laborers. Under the watchful eyes of American farmers, they learned to service the machines, grease bearings, replace worn belts, and troubleshoot engines. Manuals with clear diagrams and step-by-step instructions became unexpected treasures, unlocking the secrets of these mechanical giants. The prisoners saw, often with a mixture of envy and admiration, how American ingenuity flowed from factories to fields, reshaping rural life at its very roots. For many, these lessons were unsettling. They had come from a continent battered by war, where progress had been interrupted by destruction, and where hunger still haunted the future. Now, surrounded by fields that seemed limitless and machines that turned hard labor into routine, they were forced to rethink everything they thought they knew about farming, about technology, and about what a nation could achieve when it put its mind, and its machines, to work. The knowledge seeped into them, quietly but persistently, leaving a mark that would last long after the fences and watchtowers were gone. They started to see these machines as more than just tools for getting work done. They seemed to represent a whole way of thinking, practical, focused on solving real problems. Most nights, talk in the barracks circled back to the same question. Why hadn't Germany, with all its technical genius, put that kind of effort into farming? Back home, they'd built tanks and rockets, but here, American farmers had machines that, in their own way, helped win the war too. For a lot of these men, it was the first time they realized victory didn't just happen on battlefields. It happened quietly in fields overflowing with crops. So when harvest season rolled around, the suspicion they'd felt toward this work faded. Now it just felt inevitable. Months of farm labor had changed something in them. They still knew the work would be hard, but it wasn't the punishment they dreaded. The Americans didn't just give them busy work. Every chore mattered. With the wheat turning gold and the corn standing tall, the prisoners found themselves right in the thick of rural life, just as things got busiest. They'd get up at dawn, guards at their side, though honestly, sometimes the guards felt more like babysitters than jailers, and head out to fields already buzzing with activity. Every day brought a new job. Some guys swung scythes in the tight corners where tractors couldn't reach, cutting stalks in a steady, practiced motion. Others hauled heavy sacks of grain, stacking them into pyramids that cast long shadows beside the barns. The ones with no knack for manual labor learned to sort, husk, or load wagons headed for the grain elevators. The Americans worked fast. Everything had its place. One group cut, another hauled, another stored. The whole thing ran with the precision of a military operation. What struck the Germans most was the closeness of it all. They didn't just work with each other. They worked side by side with local farm hands, teenagers too young for the draft, older men who'd stayed behind, and sometimes even women filling in for husbands or sons away at war. For the first time since their capture, they weren't cut off from civilian life. They watched American families in action. Kids chasing chickens or leading cows, wives preparing huge meals for a crowd of hungry workers. The food especially stuck with them. During harvest, Lunches were simple but generous. Thick sandwiches, jars of pickles, slices of pie that felt almost decadent after months of black bread. Sure, the Geneva Convention said they had to be fed, but it was the little things. A farmer's daughter handing over an apple, a cool drink offered without a second thought, that really got to them. It blurred the difference between enemy and neighbor. And the work itself, well, it humbled them. Some of the men who'd once taken pride in their military toughness found farm labor nearly impossible. Hours under the hot sun, muscles aching, sweat soaking their shirts. This was endurance of a different kind. But unlike war, this exhaustion led to something you could actually see. Wagons loaded with grain, silos filling up. Even in captivity, the satisfaction started to show in their conversations. Respect grew in small ways. When a farmer corrected a clumsy pitchfork grip, and then gave a friendly pat on the shoulder, that simple gesture meant more than any barked command. It was a reminder that honest work could bring people together, even with barbed wire and uniforms in the way. They weren't just learning to harvest, they were learning that labor could be a kind of language, something they all shared. As the days shortened and the fields emptied, something else clicked. This abundance wasn't an accident. It came from planning, teamwork, and knowledge passed down over generations, all backed by a country determined to feed itself. The harvest, for the Germans, stopped being just a season of hard work. It became a lesson in how a nation kept itself strong, feeding families, supporting armies, and winning wars without ever firing a shot. In the end, what changed them most wasn't the machinery or even the sweat. It was realizing that farming was about people. Out in the fields, conversation grew as naturally as the crops. Even if words were broken, or they had to rely on gestures, the prisoners started to piece together bits of American life. Some guards, especially those with German roots, helped translate and smooth things over. Others just encouraged them to try out a few English words. Little by little, the divide between prisoner and local shrank, and the work itself did the rest. These small, everyday moments cracked open a space for real cultural exchange. Nothing to do with politics or military stuff. One afternoon, while fixing fences, a farmer started talking about his land. He said it had been in his family for 3 generations. He talked about it like it was a living thing, something handed down, not just dirt. One of the German prisoners, whose father also worked a small farm back in Thuringia, felt an instant connection. They'd grown up oceans apart, separated by war, but both knew what it meant to belong to a patch of earth. Sometimes the guards handed out food the Germans had never even heard of. Sweet potatoes, peanut butter, corn on the cob roasted right in its husk. The flavors were strange, generous even, and nothing like the rationed scraps they remembered from home. There was music too. On weekends, farm radios played country songs or big band swing, not the heavy military marches the prisoners grew up with. A few of them tried to whistle along, getting the rhythms all wrong but grinning anyway. The younger Americans sometimes laughed at the effort. Not meanly, just surprised to see their so-called enemies tapping their feet to Benny Goodman or Glenn Miller. These little moments gave the Germans a glimpse of an America they'd only seen in propaganda. Now it was real, lived in, messy, and full of small joys. Sometimes, books or newspapers made their way into the prisoners' hands. Sure, they were censored, but even so, the Germans saw people arguing about crop prices, local fairs, or how to deal with labor shortages. The openness was shocking compared to the tightly controlled news at home. Even in wartime, Americans argued, disagreed, and worried out loud. Sundays brought another surprise. Some prisoners got to attend church services, sitting quietly in wooden pews next to American families. The sermons talked about forgiveness, the harvest, and peace. The words weren't always clear, but the feeling was familiar, like being back in their own village churches. In those moments, the uniforms faded, and a sense of shared humanity crept in. What really threw them, though, was the lack of hatred. Farmers who had lost sons overseas didn't spit or curse at them. Women juggling farm and home didn't lash out. Instead, the Americans treated them with a kind of practical acceptance. They were workers, not enemies. This quiet civility unsettled men raised to believe Americans were corrupt or decadent. As the weeks rolled by, The Germans realized they were learning more than just how to work the land. They saw an entire culture's bond with its soil and community. The lessons they carried back every evening weren't just about irrigation or machines. They were about how strength could show up in food, neighbors, and stubborn resilience, not just in weapons. At first, the Germans stepped onto American farms with a quiet arrogance. They believed their country had perfected discipline, order, and efficiency, especially in farming. But after months of working side by side, that confidence started to crack. What seemed rough or unsophisticated turned out to be smart, carefully planned. A whole system built on know-how and hard choices. The older soldiers grumbled the loudest. They said Americans wasted too much, that all those machines made people lazy. But even they had to admit the results. Barns stuffed with grain, fields packed with healthy cattle, silos rising like monuments to abundance. Gradually, respect replaced skepticism. The Germans started to see that all this plenty wasn't luck. It came from embracing technology, scientific research, and government support. The turning point came when they helped measure test plots of hybrid corn. Back home, tradition ruled, and scarcity limited change. But here, hybrid seeds grew taller, fatter, and tougher than anything they knew. The surprise was obvious. Science, not luck, made the harvest. Some whispered that Germany's pride in rockets and submarines had blinded it to revolutions happening right under their noses, in the fields. Their respect deepened as they saw firsthand how farms weren't just homes. They were full-on businesses. Farmers tracked every expense, tried out new fertilizers, and somehow managed to invest in better equipment, even with wartime shortages making everything harder. County agents from the agricultural extension programs would show up too, not to boss anyone around, but to offer advice on planting or soil care. For the prisoners, this was wild. Back home in Germany, government officers barked orders and demanded quotas. Here, officials actually wanted to help. By winter, something had shifted in the barracks. The old jokes about American farming faded away. Now, the prisoners argued over which ideas might work back in Europe. Some swore mechanization was the answer. Others put their hopes in education and research. A few, caught off guard by how little they'd really known, admitted they'd underestimated farming altogether. They started talking about farmers the way they used to talk about generals, recognizing them as leaders, just fighting a different kind of battle. Not against soldiers, but against hunger and scarcity. It was a quiet shift, but it ran deep. Where there'd been scorn, there was now respect. Curiosity edged out dismissal. Every day in the fields chipped away at their old image of America as wasteful or soft. They started seeing discipline in neat rows of corn, precision in the way machines worked the fields, and real resilience in soil cared for by science instead of brute force. Propaganda had shaped their thinking, but that was getting rewritten, one furrow at a time. As the war dragged on, their focus changed. Less talk about battles, more about what life might look like after they went home. The lessons from the American fields started to feel like seeds, little pieces of hope for Germany's future. In the barracks, the talk turned to what could actually be done. Could these machines, these methods, breathe life into a broken country? The cities might be in ruins, but the countryside felt like the key to recovery. Some prisoners, especially the farm boys, thought about their families' struggles before the war. They remembered fathers fighting tired soil, mothers rationing flour, whole savings wiped out by sick livestock. Compared to the big, organized American farms, those old memories seemed ancient. Now they imagined going home with more than just stories. They pictured bringing back crop rotation, contour plowing, irrigation, hybrid seeds. A few who'd studied agriculture or taught school before the war even started impromptu classes in camp. They drew irrigation systems in the dirt, shared tattered notebooks full of terms like nitrogen fixation, and debated how to make these American ideas work in Europe. They argued that when peace finally came, Germany would need more than rebuilt factories. It would need new farms to feed people and keep famine away. Hope started to sneak in ways nobody expected. American farmers showed them that progress wasn't only about machines, it was also about the systems behind them. Things like farm cooperatives, government loans, and extension services gave support German farmers had never known. Some prisoners wondered if their own country could ever offer that kind of help. They dreamed of networks where farmers shared knowledge and tools, breaking the old isolation that had always held their villages back. Still, not everyone felt at ease. Some worried that bringing home ideas from the enemy would look like betrayal. Others doubted Germany could ever afford big tractors or irrigation pumps. But hope stuck around. Even in hushed late-night talks, they planned ways to make do, fixing old tools with new tricks, trying out crop rotations on tiny plots, saving the best seeds for next year. They knew this education was a strange twist of fate. America had just needed extra hands in the fields, but in the process, it had given these men knowledge that could last long after the guns went silent. These former enemies started to see themselves as bearers of something valuable, new ways to rebuild. They weren't naive. They knew it would be hard, maybe even brutal, but they felt that what they'd learned out in those American fields could make all the difference. By spring 1945, the camps buzzed with this quiet, stubborn hope. The end of the war was coming, and nobody knew exactly what that would mean. But the lessons about soil, machines, and new methods stuck with them. They'd become part of how these men saw their own future. So, in a way, American farms sowed more than just crops during the war. They planted ideas that would take root far from home. When the armistice finally came close, the German prisoners realized their days in America were almost over. For months, they'd worked the fields and barns day in and day out. What they took with them wasn't just exhaustion or memories. They left with a whole collection of experiences that would shape how they saw themselves and the world. Switching from soldiers to farmhands changed them in ways nobody saw coming. They looked back and saw the difference. Life before capture was all about destruction, counting shells and friends who never made it back. But in America, their days ticked by in a different way. Seeds in the ground, animals fed, grain stored up for winter. It flipped everything they'd been taught to value. Some felt embarrassed for underestimating the farm power that kept the Allied armies strong. Others just felt humbled by the steady, quiet pride of rural life. Leaving camp was bittersweet. Some of them had managed to form small bonds with local families. A kind word here, a respectful nod there. A few got simple gifts as they left, things like photos, a pocket tool, or a Bible. Just small reminders that there was still some kindness left in the world, even in the middle of war. For guys who'd braced for nothing but hostility, these moments proved that their time in captivity had taught them more than how to farm. It was a lesson in getting along. On the long trip back to Europe, the prisoners talked about what they'd find at home. German cities, Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg, were in ruins, but out in the countryside, villages and farms survived. They knew Germany's future depended on getting food production going again, fast. Some made up their minds to use everything they'd learned, rotating crops, trying out new seeds, or working with the kind of efficiency they'd seen in American fields. They'd also picked up a respect for machines, even if they doubted Germany could match America's fleets of tractors and harvesters. But honestly, the practical stuff wasn't even the most important part. The real change was personal. They'd seen a place where people built abundance together, where education and trust in science mattered more than politics. Communities pulled together, shared the load, and respected each other, even prisoners. That was hard to square with what they'd always believed, but there was no unseeing it. When the camps finally emptied and the trains rolled east, the prisoners knew they weren't going back as the same men. For some, what they learned would lead to small changes on German farms. For others, it just stayed as a quiet memory, something to compare to everything they'd known before. But for almost all of them, those years on American soil changed their idea of real power. It wasn't just bombers and tanks that had beaten them. It was a country that fed itself, confidently and wisely. So their story didn't end with bitterness. It ended with reflection. They went home, not as the same men who'd been captured, but as reluctant students of a new kind of war, one fought with seeds and machines, not guns. And that silent change became the real legacy of their time behind those American fences. Understanding that real resilience starts with cultivation, not conquest.